in this series entitled Remembering God's Miracles. And we're going to open with a word of prayer, and we are going to get started. Lord, thank you so much as we entertain again our American history, as we go back in time to try to make sense, to try to understand when we're dealing now tonight with one of the more difficult issues that's faced our nation. We pray, Lord, that you'll give us understanding, discernment, that you'll help us not to get caught in the trap of trying to interpret and understand the events of 250 years ago through the age in which we live now, but help us to really understand by historically learning what was really going on. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so for 10 weeks, we've been discussing great miracles that happened in the American Revolution that really moved the direction or the outcome into our favor, that over and over again, not what people, historians so much wrote afterwards, but those that really experienced it, the people that were going through the events and through the different battles of the American Revolution, what they wrote concerning God showing up, that God's intervention took place. But now we move into the last 2 weeks, in weeks 11 and 12, handling two issues or dealing with two issues that always come up when you try to convince people that it's important for us to study our nation's history from a godly perspective, because you won't make any sense of it just looking at it from a secular viewpoint. And that's unfortunately what a lot of people write about from a secular viewpoint. They just don't even deal with the concept of a God, a providentially interacting God in the affairs of men. And when they forget to do that, or they willfully don't do that, then they deprive people of actually knowing the history of our nation. And so for 10 weeks, we've dealt with that. These last 2 weeks, we're going to deal with two issues that always come up. First one being slavery. It usually is formed in this regard. Oh, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, they all had slaves. Why would I want to believe anything that they said? And it's very naive, obviously, and I think it's usually used for an excuse, not taking the time to really find out the truth. So we want to take a look at the truth tonight. We want to take a look at George Washington and Thomas Jefferson in particular, and indeed, they did own slaves. The issue we want to deal with, though, is what they went through, how they interpreted, whether they were for it or against it, and were they less than good people because they had to tolerate it within their times. So we want to take a look at that tonight. So we're going to begin right now. To understand how the evil known as slavery was introduced to our country, a short history of its arrival in American or on American soil is important. Early British slaving voyages dated to 1562. John Hawkins is considered the first English slave trader. He left England in 1562 on the first of three slaving voyages. At that time, British interest lay with the west coast of Africa. Plantation slavery was introduced in the Americas between 1619 and 1640. Britain and Portugal were the two most prominent slave trading countries, accounting for about 70% of all Africans transported to the Americas. By 1640, slavery of black Africans was established on American soil. Britain was the most dominant between 1640 and 1807. It is estimated that Britain transported 3.1 million Africans to the British colonies in the Caribbean, North and South America, and other countries. From the beginning, opposition voices emerged, condemning slavery in America. One of the first of those voices, or those voicing opposition, were the Quakers of Pennsylvania. In 1688, Pennsylvania Quakers adopted the first formal anti-slavery resolution in American history. And so what I did was I brought tonight it's basically like almost 4 pages of that resolution which they produced. But I wanted to read to you part of it, just little excerpts from it tonight. Again, this was written in 1688 by the Quakers of Pennsylvania that they presented in their monthly meeting. Quoting, "These are the reasons why we are against the trafficking of men as follows." And then they went on to say, "Now, though they are black, we cannot conceive there is more liberty to have them slaves as it is to have other white ones. There is a saying," quoting again, "that we shall do to all men like as we will be done ourselves, marking no difference of what generation, descent, or color they are." They go on to say, "But to bring hither or to rob and sell them against their will, we stand against." Going on, they say, "What thing in the world can be done worse towards us than if men should rob or steal us away and sell us for slaves to strange countries, separating husbands from their wives and children?" And they go on to present their belief that this was inhumane and definitely it was unchristian. And so I wanted just to share a little bit of that as we proceed. By 1640, slavery of black Africans was established on American soil. From the beginning, opposition voices emerged, condemning slavery like the one I just read. Then, as sentiment against Britain grew during the 1700s, the slave trade issue took center stage. Now, I'm going to now read to you something from 1773. So we started with a reading from 1688. Now we're going to 1773, and then we're going to go throughout the latter part of the 1700s into the 1800s, because I want you to get a feel of what was happening in America on American soil at the time. Okay? The slave trade issue took center stage. In 1773, an anonymous piece was presented to the Massachusetts legislature revealing public sentiment during this period leading up to our Declaration of Independence, which would take place 3 years later. This was presented to the Massachusetts legislature in 1773, 3 years before declaring our independence. Quote, "Gentlemen, having seen a petition that is intended to be laid before you in the name of many slaves living in Boston and other towns in the province, praying that you would be pleased to take their unhappy state and condition under consideration and give them such relief as is consistent with your wisdom, justice, and goodness, I am led to make a few observations on the subject, which I hope may not be unuseful previous to your taking it up. First, we have been for a number of years contending and struggling for the recovery of our natural and charter rights, and yet never appeared to consider that we act in direct opposition thereto." What's being referred to there is, as a British colony, they had to do what Britain said, but even in British law, things were taking place that he's trying to appeal to here. Continuing, "I always understood that no laws could be enacted contrary to the charter as a colony, and it is plain that at the granting it, there was an intent that all people who should ever inhabit within the province should enjoy the same liberties and privileges as if in England. And by a late memorable case determined at the highest court of common law at home in England, it was decreed that no person can be held as a slave otherwise than by an express law of the country or colony he lives in, and that there is any such law in the province of the Massachusetts Bay, I absolutely deny. Therefore, I conceive you cannot, in justice to the Negroes, your own consciences, and the spirit and intention of the charter, find that they are justly and legally kept in bondage, or that they shall be so in future. Secondly, the practice of making slaves here is expressly against the laws of God, which are of higher obligation than those of nations or provinces, as is mentioned in Exodus chapter 21. Thirdly, it is incompatible with the laws which Christ delivered concerning our duty one to another, and which is agreeable to the rules of nature and society, to do unto others as we would they should do to us, as the very idea of slavery is so detestable to every generous mind, and as we hear daily of town meetings and consulting upon the infringements that have been lately made upon our natural and charter rights, and passing resolves to that effect, pray what can be we think of ourselves when there is hardly a head of a family but has one or more examples of bondage in his house. End of quote. Thomas Jefferson of Virginia inherited slaves, but desired an end to King George III's demands for its continuation. In Jefferson's original penning of the Declaration of Independence. Now, the Declaration of Independence went through modifications before it would go before, the legislature of a colony, okay? In Jefferson's original penning of the Declaration of Independence, his hatred for the institution of slavery is obvious. Referring to King George III, Jefferson stated, quote, speaking of King George III, quote, he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, that means shameful behavior, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted this negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye. He is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them by murdering the people for whom he also obtruded them. In other words, forced by warrant to do. Thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. What he's simply saying there is King George III is demanding or calling for slaves of America to rise up against their masters. But those people, those masters, didn't want it to begin with, but because they were a colony of Great Britain, King George was demanding of them to do it, and now is demanding for slaves to rise up against their masters. In other words, what Thomas Jefferson is saying here is this is not only hypocritical, it's evil. It's evil for the king to do such a thing because it really demonstrates that the original premise of having slaves is wrong in itself. End of quote. In response to this first rendering for our Declaration of Independence, John Adams, who would become the second president of the United States, John Adams later commented, quote, I was delighted with the high tone and the flights of oratory with which it abounded, especially that concerning Negro slavery, which, though I knew his Southern brethren would never suffer to pass in Congress, I certainly never would oppose. Congress cut off about a quarter of it, speaking of Thomas Jefferson's original writing. Congress cut off about a quarter of it, as I expected they would, but they obliterated some of the best of it and left all that was exceptionable, if anything, in it was. So again, what John Adams is saying, I can read it. Isn't it funny that the times change, but people don't? Nothing new under the sun. Because some of the things we're discussing tonight, you can see for different subjects, different issues, same sort of thing happening in Washington today. In 1778, with Jefferson's leadership, remember now, Thomas Jefferson will become president in 1801. He'll serve for 8 years, 1801 to 1809. But before that, this is what is being spoken of here. In 1778, with Jefferson's leadership, slave importation was banned in Virginia, one of the first jurisdictions worldwide to do so. Jefferson was a lifelong advocate of ending the trade, and as president, led the effort to criminalize the international slave trade that passed Congress, and he signed as president in 1807, shortly before Britain passed a similar law. So again, what I'm trying to do is show you that it isn't one of these things like, well, I don't want to listen to that guy. He had slaves. You have to look and see what laws they were under. First of all, as a colony, Great Britain was the master slave trader throughout the world at that time. What the Crown of England forced upon the American colonies, and then once we jettisoned our colony status and became a free nation, then what we're going to see next is what they had to deal with then in terms of the inability to actually totally change the slave trade. In 1779, as a practical solution to end the legal enslavement of humans, Jefferson supported gradual emancipation. Gradual emancipation means that instead of just saying you're now free and the people have no money and they are totally unfamiliar with the nation, to just let them go would be total emancipation. What Jefferson was in favor of was gradual emancipation with training and colonization of slaves rather than unconditional emancipation, believing that releasing unprepared people with no place to go and no means to support themselves would only bring them misfortune. Then in 1784, Jefferson proposed federal legislation banning slavery in the new territories of the North and South after 1800. So he's looking at it here progressively. He's saying by the year 1800, we want no more slavery in the states. Okay, this is written in 1784. So he proposes federal legislation banning slavery in the new territories of the North and South after 1800, but it failed to pass Congress by one vote. That's how close it came, one vote. Then on July 14th, 1787, 3 years later, Jefferson wrote to Edwards Rutledge, who was the youngest signatory of the Declaration of Independence and who later served as the 39th governor of South Carolina. Quoting, this is the letter he wrote, quote, "I congratulate you, my dear friend, on the law of your state suspending the transportation of slaves, and for the glory you have justly acquired by endeavoring to prevent it forever. This abomination must have an end, and there is a superior bench reserved in heaven for those who hasten it." On February 11th, 1788, the next year, Jefferson wrote to a French journalist, abolitionist, and revolutionary by the name of Brissot de Warville, quote, "You know that nobody wishes more ardently to see an abolition not only to the trade, but of the condition of slavery, and certainly nobody will be more willing to encounter every sacrifice for that object." So again, I think from these letters and then what he tried to legislatively pass, you can see what Thomas Jefferson, he hated it, but he was caught in it. One might ask, why didn't Jefferson just release his slaves once we won our independence from Great Britain? The Constitutional Convention of 1787 dealt with the issue of slavery. There was opposition to ending it, especially from Georgia and South Carolina, though others also voiced opposition to ending it. Eventually, those who despised the ungodly institution of slavery relented. They believed the importance of keeping the fragile nation together took precedence. And to look to the future, they placed the 3/5 clause in the body of the Constitution, believing it would hasten slavery's demise. Now, this is really important. We're going to take a look at the 3/5 clause in just a minute. And to this day, people still don't understand it. I just read of a politician, a woman of color, who was saying back then they thought I was only worth 3/5 of a person. Absolutely opposite of why it was put in the Constitution, and we're going to see that in just a minute. Additionally, Jefferson lived in Virginia. There were laws in that state, a slave-owning state, which prohibited Virginians from emancipating them. Manumission, the voluntary act of a master freeing a slave, was not always easy or possible in Virginia. At times it was illegal, and even when allowed for a time, it required court permission, which could be difficult to obtain. Adding to Jefferson's difficulty was the problem that Jefferson was in debt throughout his life, and one of Virginia's laws exposed the slaves to his debtors upon their release. That means that if he had let them go and someone took one of Jefferson's slaves as their slave, the debts that Jefferson had would be encumbered upon that slave, and so they could be taken advantage of. Jefferson believed that their release would not go well for them, with potential poverty or subsequent bad treatment by the hands of ownership by those who disliked himself, Jefferson. Despite these legal and personal constraints, Jefferson did free some enslaved people, including 2 during his lifetime, 5 in his will, and allowed 2 or 3 to escape without pursuit. What was the source of Jefferson's indebtedness? Thomas Jefferson's struggle with debt stemmed from a combination of factors. Let me share this. There are multiple people that in the American Revolution that they went either one to debtor's prison, others died in poverty because they were willing to give everything for the cause. And Thomas Jefferson's struggle with debt stemmed from a combination of factors. Number 1, inherited debt. Jefferson inherited significant debts from his father-in-law, John Wales, in the 1770s, along with land and enslaved people. In other words, if you took an inheritance, say from a father or father-in-law, also their indebtedness went with it, and he inherited debt from his father-in-law. Also, plantation agricultural challenges. While Jefferson was wealthy in land, farming proved to be an unreliable and inadequate source of income, especially during periods of economic downturn like the Panic of 1819, the Panic of 1819 was the first what would be considered nationwide economic depression in America. And very similar to what goes on from that time on, and it was due to bank failures, the failing or falling of agricultural prices. In other words, whatever the important agriculture today, it might be other things that fail, and also mass unemployment. The Panic of 1819, which caused a sharp decline in real estate values and commodity prices, exacerbated Jefferson's financial situation. Debt passed to heirs. Because of the laws of the day, Jefferson could not declare bankruptcy, and his debts were going to be passed on to his heirs. Monticello, where I hope to be in 2 weeks. Do we have a picture? There it is. There's Monticello. In 2 weeks, we'll be in Virginia and hopefully there in Williamsburg. The construction and upkeep of Monticello, his beloved state, also contributed to his indebtedness. Debt at death. Jefferson died with debts exceeding $107,000, a sum equivalent to over $1 million today. In an attempt to raise funds, Jefferson devised a public lottery to raise money and clear his debts, but it was not enough. That's the origination of the GoFundMe. Sale of assets. After Jefferson's death, his executors were forced to sell his land, household contents, and enslaved people to cover his debts. And again, one of the signers of the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, Robert Morris, ended up in poverty. Probably a person that you've never heard of, Haym Salomon, was a Jewish immigrant who was considered the greatest financial contributor to the American Revolution. Haym was probably, has anybody here heard of him? Okay, I didn't think so. He was a Jewish immigrant from Poland. He came to the United States, and he, along with Robert Morris, continually gave funds to the American Revolution. This was, for Haym's case, it was his own personal funds. He gave during his life over $600,000, which was equivalent to $15 million, to help support the American Revolution. He ended up in poverty, died in poverty, because the federal government at the conclusion would not give him any of the money back that he basically had loaned for the American Revolution. And so he died in poverty. However, today, he is, again, many people don't know of him, but if you go to Chicago, if you go to Los Angeles, if you go to Queens, New York, you're going to see monuments to him there. The one in Chicago, Illinois, shows him with George Washington and Robert Morris holding hands together because they were the financial backers of the American Revolution. And so here's an immigrant who was it was said that if he had not given money near the end of the Revolution, they would not have had the adequate supplies for the war, the Battle of Yorktown, which ended the war. He had a stamp made for him in 1975. He had a military ship was named after him. And again, a name that has been forgotten, but yet he was instrumental, and it even has monuments to him. I think it was in 1881 or somewhere around there that there was a medal made of him honoring him. So as a person well honored, well known, but again, these folks, a lot of them died in poverty. George Washington likewise condemned the practice of slavery. Now, the reason I took George Washington and Thomas Jefferson is they're the ones that people today complain the most. I don't want to hear everything and the same. Why? Because George Washington is the father of our country. Thomas Jefferson was considered probably the second, him and Benjamin Franklin, as the most instrumental. So they always want to hammer Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. But again, in previous ones, we've already shown how instrumental Benjamin was to the nation, and also how much he was not the liberal anti-God person that people make him out to be. George Washington likewise condemned the practice of slavery. He stated, quote, "I can only say that there is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery. But there is only one proper and effectual mode by which it can be accomplished, and that is by legislative authority. And this, as far as my vote and support will go, shall never be lacking." So, see, again, our founding fathers came over from Great Britain, where you had the divine right of the king, and he could throw whoever he wanted to before the Tower of London. They also had the Star Chambers, which was a secret law group that superseded normal law, which, again, he could persecute people that he didn't like. Well, our folks didn't want that. They came over here and wanted to set up a new type of society, not based on the divine right of kings, but on legislature. Three parts: the executive, the judicial, and the legislative. And so, again, instead of just saying, well, I'm just going to release all my slaves, George Washington is saying here, it has to be handled legislative. Everything has to be done according to law, because we are one nation under God. God gives us the law. It's based on do unto others as you have them do unto you, but everything has to go through the legislature to pass, and that's what he's saying there. Washington maintained this position throughout his life. When General Marquis de Lafayette, who we've studied on in past weeks, purchased a plantation of French Guiana for the purpose of freeing its slaves and placing them on the estate as tenants, Washington wrote to Lafayette, quote, "Your late purchase of an estate in the colony of Cayenne with a view of emancipating the slaves on it is a generous and noble proof of your humanity. Would to God a like spirit would diffuse itself generally into the minds of the people of this country, but I despair of seeing it. Some petitions were presented to the Virginia Assembly at its last session for the abolition of slavery, but they could scarcely obtain a reading." To his nephew and private secretary, Lawrence Lewis, Washington wrote, quote, "I wish from my soul that the legislature of this state could see the policy of a gradual abolition of slavery." So you can see whether it's George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, the people agonized over this. But they were caught in it. I mentioned on Sunday, I said, look, do we like where all of our monies go here in terms of the state? In other words, when you pay taxes, a lot of it goes here to the state. And yet there's parts of it that go to things that you probably are not in favor of: abortion, sexual transition, all that sort of stuff, and other things that you might not approve of. But does that mean you don't pay your taxes? Of course you still pay your taxes. Number one is you're going to go to jail if you don't. Guess what? Our founders, if they had just let their slaves go free, they were going to jail. Well, depending on the state in which they were. Okay. But then secondly, we still pay our taxes, even though part of it goes to things we don't approve, because we want to be law-abiding citizens. We want things to be handled in the proper manner. Okay. Some people mistakenly think the Constitution, which was passed in 1787, was a pro-slavery document. Frederick Douglass argued that the Constitution was actually an anti-slavery document by correctly interpreting the Three-Fifths Clause. And like I said, I just heard a lady of color politician saying, back when our nation was founded, they thought I was only worth 3/5 of a person, which is a lie that's been passed on and on and on over the decades. Frederick Douglass believed the opposite. This clause had nothing to do with the worth of the individual black slave. It was a compromise introduced at the Constitutional Convention by Northern anti-slavery proponents so that slave states, who always stated that their slaves were nothing but property, except when they were going to have an election, could no longer count their slaves as free persons when it came to elections. Douglass wrote, referring to the Three-Fifths Clause in 1851, quote, "It is a downright disability laid upon the slaveholding states, one which deprives those states of 2/5 of their natural basis of representation. A black man in a free state is worth 2/5 more than a black man in a slave state as a basis of political power under the Constitution. Therefore, instead of encouraging slavery, the Constitution encourages freedom by giving an increase of 2/5 of political power to free over slave states." So much for the Three-Fifths Clause. Taking it at its worst, it still leans to freedom, not slavery. For be it remembered that the Constitution nowhere forbids a colored man to vote. That was the words of Frederick Douglass. As a result of this constitutional provision, the Three-Fifths Clause, slave states could only use the 3/5 standard, which limited their number of representatives by allowing only 3 out of every 5 of their total number of slaves to be counted as votes. Remember, they're not voting. It's the slave owner, okay? And so what the Constitution did at that convention, they could not get the southern states to agree to the abolition of slavery. So what they argued with them, well, you say they're just property. You can't say to us that they're like free people, free men here. And so we're going to limit you. And finally, the South agreed to it, that from that moment on, they would only, for every 5 slaves, that owner of that land and those slaves would only get 3 votes instead of the 5, okay? Now, when you get to 1870, it's going to be changed, and that's not going to even apply anymore. Additional congressional acts concerning slavery. In 1789, the Northwest Ordinance forbade slavery in any territory seeking statehood. In 1808, Congress abolished the slave trade. Now check this out. From 1820 to 1860, that's 40 years, both the Supreme Court and Congress had a Southern Democrat majority. Thus, in 1820, the Missouri Compromise, slavery states were allowed into the Union again. 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law allowed the capture and return of freed slaves to the southern states. 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act once again allowed slavery in new territories. Then in 1854, the Republican Party was formed with its main concern, the abolishing of slavery. The Republican Party handed out their first platform, which listed 9 planks, the 9 things that the Republican Party of 1854 was based upon. 6 of the 9 planks dealt with civil rights, black equality, and the abolishing of slavery. In 1857, remember that the Southern Democrats are in control to 1860. In 1857, the Dred Scott decision passed, which declared blacks were not persons but property. This 1857 Supreme Court ruled, quote, blacks had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit, end of quote. 1860, Republican Abraham Lincoln's platform opposed the fugitive slave law and the Dred Scott decision. The platform's stated goal was to end slavery and win civil rights for all blacks. 1860 also, as a result of Abraham Lincoln and the Republican presidential victory, 11 southern states seceded from the Union, establishing the slave-holding Confederate States of America. Then in 1862, slavery was abolished in Washington, D.C. because Abraham Lincoln was now the president. In 1863, on January 1st, Abraham Lincoln brought forth the Emancipation Proclamation. Then, in 1865, the 13th Amendment was added to the Constitution, ending slavery. 100% of Republicans voted in favor of this constitutional amendment. 23% of Democrats voted in favor of this constitutional amendment. What happened next? The Ku Klux Klan was established in 1866 by Southern Democrats to intimidate and kill Republicans. The Klan killed both black and white Americans. If you were a black American during this time, you were most likely Republican. Of the 4,800 American citizens murdered by the Klan, 3,500 were black and 1,300 white. Republicans, black and white, who were working for the rights of black Americans were targeted. They were targeted by the issuing of push cards. Push cards were used by the Klan to pursue and kill Republicans, whether they were black or white. These cards had photos and names listed of white and black Republican members of state legislatures who were called radical members because they supported black American causes. Then in 1868, the 14th Amendment was added to the Constitution. Black Americans were now allowed to run for Congress and were citizens of their state of habitation. 94% of Republicans voted in favor of this amendment. 0% of Democrats voted in favor of this amendment. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed, guaranteed the right of black Americans to vote. 100% of Republicans voted in favor of this amendment. 0% of Democrats voted in favor of this amendment. Also then in 1870, Reverend Hiram Rhodes Revels became the first black American elected to the U.S. Senate. He later became the president of Alcorn College. Also that year, Joseph Haney Rainey became the first black American elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, and eventually he became Speaker of the House. The first 7 black Americans elected to Congress were Republicans. Following the Civil War from 1865 to 1876, the Republican-controlled Congress passed 23 civil rights laws. In 1871, in a congressional debate over whether Klan members could be held accountable for their crimes, an insightful and prophetic address was given by Joseph Haney Rainey. That's his picture right there. He stated, quote, "When we call to mind the fact that this Klan persecution is waged against men for the simple reason that they dare vote with the Republican Party, the question is sometimes asked, why do not the courts of law afford redress? Because the courts are in many instances under the control of Democrats who are wholly opposed to the impartial administration of law and equity. What benefit would result from appeal to courts whose officers are secretly in sympathy with the very evil against which we are striving? If Negroes, numbering 1/8 of the population of the United States, would only cast their votes in the interest of Democrats, all open measures of violence against them would immediately be suspended and their rights as American citizens recognized. But I can only say that we love freedom more, vastly more, than slavery. Consequently, we hope to keep clear of the Democrats. I will also say that in the state of South Carolina, which I represent, there is no disturbance of an alarming character in any one of the counties in which the Republicans have a majority. The troubles are usually in those sections in which the Democrats have control. I say to the entire membership of the Democratic Party that upon your hands rests the blood of the loyal men of the South. Disclaim it as you will, but the stain is there to prove your criminality before man and God. In the world, there is a day of retribution which will surely come. I pity the man or party of men who would seek to ride into power over the dead body of a legitimate opponent. I can say for my people that we are fully determined to stand by the Republican Party and the government. We have resolved to be loyal and firm, and as Queen Esther said long ago, if we perish, we perish. I earnestly hope this bill will pass. Remember, during that time that the Republican Party was in control, 23 civil rights laws were passed. In 1892, the Democrats regained control of both houses and the presidency and repealed all 23 of the civil rights laws. There would not be another civil rights law passed until 1964. In 1964-65, 83% of Republicans voted for the 2 civil rights amendments, while 62% of Democrats voted for the amendments. Now, something I need to say there, and that is when I was working inner city LA back in the 1970s, I felt that the Democratic Party was really moved more in the direction of helping and encouraging people, especially in hard situations. So when we were working inner city LA in Watts, I considered myself a fiscal Republican and a social Democrat. But what has happened now is the Democratic Party today, to me, resembles the Democratic Party that was in power of the time of slavery. Because I'm hearing same things happening, like with the issue with the borders, that saying of those that on the Democratic Party, which is all of them, that are wanting it to stay open, that then Republicans are saying the blood of Americans who've been killed by illegal immigrants, that stain is upon you and upon your hands. So some of the outlandish, what we would call woke opinions of the Democratic Party today reminds me exactly of that time before. So today, I don't consider myself a social Democrat anymore. I consider myself a person that goes by what God says. Do unto others what you'd have them do unto you, being kind to all people, trying to give people a hand up, not necessarily just a handout, but a hand up, and that we are called as Christians to lead in this manner. We're called as Christians, whether we live in the 1700s, or the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s, the 1900s, or the year 2026, to lead in righteousness. And righteousness is caring for others more than you caring even about yourself. So anyway, with that having said, any questions? And I know that for some of you it might be real new history, but it is history, and it's exactly the way it went down in terms of slavery. So what I hope that everybody's gotten out of this is the fact that these people really, I'm talking about our founders, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, that they really attempted in their lifetime to get slavery abolished. They weren't able to pull it off, but they worked hard to make it better as they went along life. And as a matter of fact, I mentioned before, George Washington, upon his death, living in Virginia, he was actually able to release his slaves because there was a loophole in the Virginia laws. But Thomas Jefferson, when he died, it was like 20-some years later, and there was no loophole anymore. So he couldn't do what George Washington was able to do. So these founders that we've quoted so many times over the last 10 weeks about their devotion to God and seeing God interact, I believe were consistent in the way that they were attempting to deal with slavery. And they were dealing with the southern democratic states who wanted slavery no matter what, and were willing to secede 11 of the states and become the Confederate States of America because they believed so much in slavery, which to me is an ungodly abomination. Any questions or thoughts? Nothing?